Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. Every month, we invite an expert to enlighten us on a topic related to our mission. Because Village TV videotapes these presentations, we can share that expertise with a larger audience. We hope you enjoy today's broadcast.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce Deike, who wants to make cities livable again where they weren't, who was impassioned by the Green Party to make this world better and greener. So, and Deike is a professor at Soka University, has been there for more than 10 years, and has seen her graduates in environmental science go off to do wonderful things. So it's my pleasure. Deike, you want to come up?
Thank you so much, Gloria, for that lovely introduction. So yeah, thank you so much to everyone for being here, Barbara for inviting me, feeding me before coming up here. Yeah, so I think I'm going to try to just get right to it and kind of explain a little bit. I understood the invitation today basically as an invitation to a conversation. I have indeed been a professor of environmental studies up at Soka University since 2013. I'm German originally, was educated for sort of graduate school mainly on the East Coast, and I've lived up in LA for the last 15 years or so. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just recent research that I've been doing, some of the older research as well, and told I have way too many slides for the time that I have, so I might skip over some things, but we'll certainly make this material available. I'm just kind of concerned to hopefully also leave some time at the end so that it can be a conversation and you can ask some questions. So I think I have to double operate both my own computer. So I usually introduce myself as an environmental urbanist, urban environmentalist, either way. I'm an urban planner by training. Any other fellow urban planners in the room? So I mainly want to talk about nature and humans, urban nature to you tonight, because like I said, I'm in the environmental studies department unit at Soka University, and we sort of very much emphasize the creative coexistence of nature and humanity. I talk to my students a lot about sort of their relationship to the environment, and how to be good stewards on this planet that obviously we haven't been very good to for a long time. But I think, so I guess this is not necessarily a talk about environmental activism per se. That I know that sort of as a group of concerned citizens, a lot of what I hear a lot of you are still doing is being very active, engaged. But I think this is sort of, for me recently, I had my first ever academic sabbatical, which is sort of a moment, an opportunity to pause and reflect a little bit. I certainly had quite a bit of activism and activist scholarship in my career before. But really, truly kind of reconsidering when we talk about the environment or nature that we're fighting for, what are we actually fighting for, and what sort of re-unpacking this notion of nature, and this idea that it's not just something that's out there, but very much something that should be still, I don't know where that came from, spliced into our lives. So again, I promised lots of pictures and not too many words just on the slides. But so what I wanted to talk to you about a little bit is sort of two urban nature restoration efforts that I've recently looked at in two places that I personally know very well. I grew up in a very industrial city in Germany, in the so-called Ruhr Valley. A lot of pollution, where essentially one of the central rivers was considered a little bit of a sacrifice zone at the time, and has since been cleaned up again in the past 30 years. So for me, it was sort of an opportunity to look at something that you consider sort of a successful urban restoration effort as one of the examples. And then the other example, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Bayona wetlands up in Los Angeles. Any people up here from? Yeah, Okay, got my team here distributed over the room, which is also sort of a 30-plus-year-old fight for a restoration of an urban wetland that went through sort of a lot of different stages of abuse, I would say. And I live very close to that wetland. I'm sort of a runner and a cyclist, and so I've actually literally spent thousands of miles sort of circumnavigating this very precious little remnant of an urban wetland that kind of deserves to be restored in many ways. Yeah, that's kind of the input. I think giving you my academic background, if I were talking to sort of a more academic audience. And I came to sort of this question of urban nature more from not just in urban planning, but also a background as someone who's mainly trained in the subdiscipline of transportation planning and policy. So someone who very much tends to look at infrastructure first, very much the built environment. And even more specifically, I was trained to look at sort of large-scale infrastructure, conflicts and investments surrounding high-speed rail. So I have a couple slides. I don't know if anybody has been following sort of the fight or the controversies over the building of the California high-speed rail project. Okay, so I have a couple of those. I guess it's an eye candy for you too. And just share sort of previous work that I pivoted to later. I'm going to skip these because you can look at that on my faculty webpage. So so some of the work I did right at the beginning when I came to SoCA, because I actually had moved to Los Angeles after spending a substantial amount of time in Berlin, in Germany. I came back here around 2008, 2009, so just when we had the proposition for high-speed rail and we're appropriating, billions of dollars to potentially build this infrastructure. And I do believe that it's an infrastructure that could potentially be very transformative for urban fabrics, and specifically in California, where we have these very two large urban centers that we might connect. But like so many different things, the devil's in the detail, right? So the competitiveness, whether or not you build this right, depends on sort of the, how you build the actual infrastructure, but also then the intermodal connectivity once you get to that final station where you might be getting off either in the Bay Area or in Los Angeles. How do you connect, right? Because I don't know how many of you have been to either Japan or Europe and actually ridden high-speed rail, like a good number, right? People enjoy that experience, right? But then you get off at the center of Paris, right? Or you're in London, you're right there in King's Cross, and you're in the middle of a city. And that is largely not the case when you're sort of envisioning of using high-speed rail here. There's not a walkable destination from that station, right? So that was sort of important, interesting research I was asked to do with a colleague up at UCLA on sort of the intermodal connectivities and some of the comparisons. I don't really expect you to be able to read all that squinty stuff. But yeah, Europe, this is France and Germany, have these beautiful high-speed rail lines that are fairly dense, that make kind of the cities shrink, connect to each other. You're getting on a train and you go from Paris to London in 3 hours. So how might that possibly work? What are some of the transferable lessons? So again, sort of intermodality as an important thing, and then really also this idea that Californians, many people had never, who recognizes where this is? Anybody? Remember?
Not London.
I'm German, remember? Berlin, there you go. So I'm just throwing this in there to sort of give people a flavor of up atop of here, this is both the local urban rail, but the high-speed rail train, the intercity trains would be going over people's head while they're having coffee, right? Right there. Obviously reducing their normal speed, but the compatibility of this technology with sort of a very vibrant, dense urban environment, right, is something that I think a lot of people had never really thought about. So I think that's part of the work that we sort of try to do, planning around stations and making people aware that, it's not this big giant infrastructure monster necessarily. It all depends on how you weave it into the urban fabric. So that's some of the work I did. There's other work I think I'm going to mainly skip over that was sort of more related to advocacy on an international scale. But another topic I worked on very much for many, many years is this question of inequality and gender differences in transportation infrastructure and policy and planning. And I think I read or saw somewhere that you, in fact, had Sandy Rosenblum speak here at some point. I don't know how long ago that was. Yeah. I saw that on your YouTube channel. So, I mean, this is probably somebody who knows more, even more about this topic than I do. But let me just give you a couple slides to just something that also, like in my career as sort of environmental urbanist, I've been very passionate about, especially when it comes to international comparative issues. Talking about issues surrounding difference and inequality, equity, and I mean, I'm assuming a lot of you know this, have experienced this idea when we talk about travel burdens and the difficulty of getting around. One of the core problems from an urban planning and transportation perspective is that women still tend to just have the greater responsibility for household chores, transport burdens, the trip chaining, because mostly they're still the ones dropping off kids at school. So the transportation needs are not, are different, not primarily because of overwhelming physical differences, because of the societal inequities and the we call sort of the unequal household allocation of transport tasks and resources, and that is obviously infinitely more dramatic in a lot of countries and cities in the global south, where I was sort of engaged in working in at the time. So it was a really gratifying thing to kind of be able to draft a bunch of policy papers around that. I don't know, all of these terms are obviously in many ways going away, but this idea of gender mainstreaming, transportation planning and policy, integrating needs into sort of larger issues, and ultimately overcoming what people would say was very much sort of a stereotyping in this particular subsector of urban planning. So overcoming one-dimensional and simplistic thinking about who fulfills which kinds of transportation roles. And at the same time also catching up with sort of a now fairly established larger body of research that actually does establish the fact that the root causes of these gender imbalances have to do with sort of the undervaluing of reproductive tasks, but also just simply sort of the power relationship, the inferior access to vehicles and transportation and decision making. And how it doesn't always have to be about the car, because in many countries around the world, you might not even have a car. So then possibly the most coveted means of transportation could be a motorcycle, and you're the one left on the bike. But yeah, so that's just sort of giving you a flavor, a couple images, these sort of universal truth that we found over and over confirmed in the literature. Women are more likely to be passengers regardless of the mode of transportation. So how are we sort of creating a more enabling environment that really ultimately privileges this more localized reproductive and unencumbered travel? And so really gratifying work for many, many years, having a more enabling environment. Absorb some of these, right? Some of these images kind of speak for themselves, right? So this idea of creating barrier-free stations, vehicles. So just to say that a lot of my previous career was centered around thinking about infrastructure, right? And rectifying sort of built environment things. So what I did then in the last 2, 3, 4 years was mainly more about adding urban nature and renaturing to my resume. I thought quite a bit about the importance of outdoor education. Remember, I teach mainly undergrads, so they're 18 to 22 years old, and increasingly in my conversations with my students, I realized, and it's not a very insightful realization, how time indoors, of course, kids these days spend, right? I mean, in front of screens. So sort of so what Richard Louv has called nature deficit disorder, right? So lack of vitamin N, they don't get out. But that's a very real thing, and we know that this is, leading to anxiety, and how little it often takes for them to get outside. So like the so-called nature gap, who then actually has a viable, vibrant urban park in front of their doorstep. Really important questions about reconnecting and not, especially young people to environmental causes, because how are you ever going to value a wetland if you've never been to one, right? I mean, I asked my students today, I had wetlands on the agenda, and how many of them had ever been to the Bolsa Chico or the Bayona wetlands, and not really any of them, right? So that became increasingly important, sort of making that part of my research agenda, and sort of pivoting from that to this importance of then restoring the restorative qualities of nature, right? So urban restoration as something that I became increasingly interested in. So we don't have any restoration ecologists in the room? Biologists? I was going to say, well, no, at least one, but he's not raising his hand. So I'm really puzzled or intrigued by this notion of us restoring nature, right? Because so much of environmental advocacy in the short history is usually about protecting or conserving, right? We're sort of keeping something the way it is. But sort of in a post-industrial world, where we've degraded the environment so much, this idea of ecological restoration, we're putting nature back, is something that I think is also on a philosophical and pragmatic level very puzzling, because what nature are we restoring things back to, right? What version of nature, is a wetland? Well, I mean, there's obviously native people who were engaged with that environment before us. So is the wetland before we drained it, before we had a rancho on it, before we extracted the oil, before we dredged a marina? When we go back and say we want to restore a wetland, we want to put nature back, it's actually a really, really important question to say, well, who's nature? What are we privileging in terms of the ecology, the environment? Who gets to say that this becomes a saltwater marsh or freshwater basin again, right? So I think, and it's important. I mean, yes, we want to go back and make things more biologically viable, and biodiversity is good, and at least, you put the water back and different kinds of shorebirds come back. But I think I just became really, really fascinated by this idea. So. And I think it's a conversation that is sort of in that young profession of restoration ecology and ecological restoration is still an open question, and people are still at this and having conversations. So as someone who comes from a built environment perspective, I just became really, really fascinated by it and wanted to learn more about it, because I have this wetland right in front of my doorstep, and I'll tell you more about it and show you some slides, because the core problem with sort of why the restoration of the Bayona wetlands are contested is because the environmentalists are disagreeing about themselves. They're actually kind of hampering each other, because they're still fighting over which version of nature they want back. And I just was absolutely fascinated by that. And I'm still, find a way to sort of overcome that. So yeah, I think I'm gonna skip over some of the other things and go right to the actual wetlands. And the research themes. And again, and the comparisons and how we talk about this. And this is a little academic-y, you don't have to absorb it all, but there's all these interesting conversations about a first, a second, and a third, and a fourth nature. And think about it, I mean, especially in sort of a lot of the German literature. Well, is there ever a pristine nature? But a garden is a form of nature, right? Agriculture is a form of nature. An abandoned industrial lot where sort of weeds and sort of ruderal ecologies have been able to reestablish themselves, that's nature too. So all of these different ideas kind of deserve their place and their attention a little bit. So here you have finally the Bayona wetlands and a snapshot of it. if I knew how to use this clicker. It's just north of LAX, right? I mean, you essentially have, I don't know how this works. Let me see. Does this work? There we go. So this is obviously Venice Beach, right? Marina del Rey, right? LAX will be right here. And I think, but most people wouldn't recognize this place. That's the Ballona wetland, and people don't think about it. It's right there. But it's LA's last remaining larger wetland. It's about 600 acres, very degraded ecosystem, sort of chopped up into 4 different bits, Culver Boulevard, kind of Lincoln Boulevard. A fascinating place that people, the Friends of the Ballona Wetlands, fought for tooth and nail in the 90s and before to get it protected and to not have it be developed. Because this stuff right here, the Playa, has anybody ever been to Playa Vista? I mean, that's Silicon Beach, right? That's just like, that's the old Howard Hughes airfield. And that's where the Spruce Goose was built. And of course, when Howard Hughes passed away, and sort of the heirs were selling that land for development, and you know, you wanted DreamWorks and major movie studio, everybody wanted to come. They wanted to develop the whole thing. So the environmentalists were ultimately successful in sort of protecting 3 out of the 4 quadrants, I guess. If you, let me see if I can, right? There's these different areas. And then we sort of get a new urbanist community, planned community built on what was the other area. But then they kind of went ahead and did protect it, but it's still super degraded. So we're not really restoring it. It's just sitting there, a little bit at an impasse. Parts of it were. But so it's a really fascinating way to thinking through some of these things. And again, just going back in history a little bit, fascinating ideas of sort of our terrible relationship with land, what it once was, the oil drilling, kind of just the abuse it's taken over the years. And of course, the story of urbanism and urbanization is always kind of the straitjacketing of our waterways, right? Because this idea of human settlements is when we settle in a place. And the one thing we always end up doing is putting water somewhere where it can't alter the landscape. I mean, it's such a pervasive theme, and I think we don't give enough credit to sort of the importance of water and us straitjacketing water in our cities. And that's certainly what was done with the Ballona Creek in the 1930s, same with the LA River. So that's done, and then we kind of go on and also, extract the oil, dredge the marina, and then you kind of have this celebration of the environmentalists who at least then wrestled to the concessions from the developer to create a freshwater marsh and a portion of it. And there's the bike path. So I think that's it's a complicated place, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It sort of has this mix of different wetland habitats. It has brackish, freshwater marshes, riparian, upland habitats, sand dunes, but different habitat types. And again, you don't have to absorb all that, but the how to improve is where it gets tricky, right? There is an official restoration master plan. 2017, 19, I'll have to put on my glasses. But again, so should this be a full tidal wetland again? So if you've been to the Bolsa Chica wetlands, that's kind of what they did, right? They celebrated reconnecting it to the ocean. But is that the best solution? There's a lot of people, a lot of sort of eminent restoration ecologists that would say, there was a lot more freshwater. So they're kind of arguing for a gentler restoration alternative. So the discourses are really fascinating because on one hand, you sort of have the official master plan and official Heal the Bay and Friends of the Ballona Wetlands people who are advocating for very, very bulldozer-heavy restoration. So you're doing a lot of engineering, a lot of moving earth around to put nature back. But it's no putting back. It's actually a completely new vision of what you're creating there. And another camp of people that are sort of saying, We don't really want that. We acknowledge the fact that this is kind of a dumped upon degraded land, but there are some species, a flora, fauna, that we shouldn't be disturbing, and we should kind of find a gentler way to re-engage with nature there. And the answer is probably somewhere in between. But so that's one place that where I've partially tried with my students to come back and say, well, at least kind of let's overcome this impasse of not talking to each other anymore, right? So, yeah, very contested. I think the large-scale engineering approach, obviously, also is not very self-correcting if you're sort of committing to a big solution. Flexible phasing is problematic. And the thing that kind of kills me is really that people on both sides of this issue are incredibly committed environmentalists. And one of the things that was beautiful to do kind of with my students, inviting and asking some of these people to speak recently, is they're so united by their absolute love of birds, of the diversity. This is obviously a birding hotspot, but yet sort of the minutia of the solutions that they prefer kind of keeps people from advancing forward together. Yeah, so that's maybe all I want to say about that. And then I have, do I have a couple more minutes? How much longer do you think I should? And then the other thing I wanted to talk to you about is then my original hometown in Germany, which is sort of a second interesting case of nature restoration. You could just sort of talk rewilding in sort of this very post-industrial urban landscape that has its own fascinations, I think, in many ways. So I think I said already in the beginning, so why would I want to look at that? Well, for me, it's coming home, right? When I committed to being an urban planner in my early 20s, back in the early 90s, studying urban planning in my hometown, this restoration effort was just beginning. So it's kind of a really neat thing to then leave home 2 years after to go to different universities and graduate schools and only ever visit home for a few days at a time, but at the same time, in the background, there is this incredible 30-year restoration effort that actually gets completed and becomes kind of a world-famous example in its own right through my lifetime. And I wanted to just know more about the how and why and how that all unfolded. And it has such a profound impact also on the presence and the way that my hometown is even now perceived. So first of all, question just a little bit of an insider-outsider view. Who has been to Germany? Here. Only one person? Fellow German? Okay, you guys need to go. Sorry. Or you're just not admitting to it because your next question is going to be, where's the Ruhr Valley? But so it's fine. So Dortmund, Germany, the Ruhr Valley, it's essentially, I try to explain it as the Pittsburgh of Germany. It's old industrial, coal mining, steel production, right? Deindustrializing, because that all went away, at least in my lifetime. And so fragmented, it's sort of a whole series of cities that are never larger than 500,000 people, but they all started out as little coal mining villages. Lots of Polish immigrants who came at the time built up that industry. Very much. But it's always had a green side to it because you couldn't completely overwhelm the entire landscape with just coal mines and steel production. But so it's sort of a known example as very much people sort of talk about it as the in-between city, because there isn't one very large metropolis at the heart of it, but it's actually one of Europe's, or certainly Germany's, biggest metropolitan region. So there's the Rhine-Ruhr area has 10 million people, which 10 million people is sort of the threshold by which you call something a megacity. But each individual place has only about 500,000 people. So kind of also famous for that, and in the realm of urban planning, and very much kind of reinventing itself in the post-industrial era. It's a little bit sort of like Detroit also, when you're saying, well, what are you doing with all these buildings, right? And the repurposing and the rethinking. But yeah, so within Germany, I'll go one back here, see if I can operate the clicker. Yeah, so I mean, West Germany, I can't actually see this very well, but old West Germany. And this is more what people would have thought of 30 years ago. Not so surprising. I mean, yes, it's a trick. It's in black and white. Yeah, the other pictures were in color. That's like but the contrast between what's green and what's gray and what is sort of industrial and grimy and has bad air pollution with sort of steel production. So the interesting thing is it's called the Ruhr Valley region, and the Ruhr was the drinking water river, and the Emsche was basically the sacrifice river, the other river that we just put all the pollutants in. Because if you're mining an area, you cannot actually have underground wastewater, right? Because your ground is always shifting and sinking, and there's too much movement in the earth to have an underground channelized wastewater system. So the Emsche became the sacrifice river. It was channelized, and it was just a stinking, awful water that was basically deprived of its identity at the time, and very much in need of saving at the time once industrialization had sort of moved on, once the mining was over, once the steel production was no longer economically viable. And so it really kind of correlated with sort of my coming of age, or, as wanting to be a planner, this very famous international, it's called an International Building Exhibition. I don't know if there's architects in the room at least, no? Okay, I keep fishing. But a 30-year horizon for an effort around sort of greening, renaturing. NBS and NBI stands for nature-based infrastructure. So this is something where people are coalescing around the idea of using nature as an infrastructure. But so you have these interesting discourses around the river being a river of reconciliation, right? We're making good with the environment. We sacrificed you back in the old days, now we're bringing you back. And also enlivening a lot of that sort of with cultural activation, fun stuff, sort of rethinking, interesting ideas. But yeah, so I mean, the key facts for this case study would kind of be, you settle, you industrialize, you make it a cloac. You have what people call sort of hygienic conversion, which is just you put a straitjacket. Yeah, I mean, you've got to love some of the discourses. Modernization is, oh yeah, well, we are going to be better about sewage treatment. We're going to have pumping stations. We're sort of testing revitalization, but sort of the full ecological reconversion, wastewater-free conversion is not until very recently. I mean, this is something that the German chancellor sort of celebrated as recently as 2-3 years ago. But so what was fascinating by this whole discourse is what I discovered, that mainly the more I looked, I realized, oh, I'm back to my old things, because it's an engineering project more than anything else. So people have these discourses around greening, but really what was going on, that this is like Europe's largest wastewater project. It's a $4.5 billion project to finally dig these canals, the wastewater, for millions of people. And pumps, we're gonna have to pump forever because the land has been permanently disturbed and sinking. So I think it's just a really interesting story how when you dig and people have these discourses around nature and conversions, that in the end of the day, we're kind of stuck still engineering, right? I mean, nature doesn't just magically recover by itself. So yeah, just giving you a couple images to look at. Really not so natural, but also incredibly fascinating, right? I mean, the above ground that we see looks so transformative. But I think for me, it was in many ways a lesson, because you had to have the billions of euros in this case to clean it up from below, because you still need to discharge the wastewater somewhere. So yeah, I think these are just kind of eye candy for you to understand a little bit for what it meant for people in the region to either live in Exhibit A versus Exhibit B, right? Kind of streams that then also once they are, and then you don't even need to rip everything out, right? This is just you take out the pollutants and you regreen, and it's a planting issue, right? And then one of the most interesting things here is you'll love this. So the actual old steelworks are still there at the time, and they literally sold it off to the Chinese, who came, and for 2 years, sort of a group of Chinese workers, bit for bit, dismantled the entire factory, rebuilt it somewhere over in China, and once they were done, we basically said, and now we're going to make Lake Mission Viejo, right? And we created a nice lake. We say we, I mean, it's my hometown, but a lake where all the well-paid, high-income international soccer players now live, because we're no longer just a steel producing, but a soccer town. Any soccer fans in the room? Who's Team Christian Pulisic? That's where he first lived, right, and started playing. So yeah, I mean, fascinating to kind of think about how we dismantle. This is from a different site. This is what we had. This is what we do. No, it's what the Chinese took it away. We start flooding, and then we make it nice. And this is sort of where the new upper middle classes in the city now live. So really interesting story, really, of sort of urban renaturalization and transformation. But yeah, so I mean, I guess wrapping up, because I wanted to make sure people get a chance to ask questions. What can we learn from some of these cases? What's interesting about it? So really kind of, I keep still wanting to unpack these entangled notions of urbanized naturescapes and really go beyond what planners in my world sort of use as, they talk about nature-based solutions. But it's really sort of re-enhancing ecological functions, but in sort of a complicated, interesting way. And yeah, how much heavy engineering does sort of nature need these days? It's an interesting question, because I think for me, this idea that the renaturing of my home river only became possible with the end of the coal mining and the construction of the sewer canal was not immediately obvious at the beginning. So I think the Bayona restoration would also require bulldozing, tidal gates, residual dredging. So it's a tricky thing. So understanding kind of the interactions, interdependencies that humans and companion species have, wildlife, I mean, which version of freshwater, saltwater we privilege is going to keep me up for a while longer. And then, yeah, and then I'm just back from this beautiful sabbatical where I wasn't just focused on teaching new content to my students the whole time. So I will get to go back to Germany, probably do a couple more interviews and finish, and hopefully have a more polished or published version of some of these thoughts on urban renaturing. And I think we talked over dinner about the fact that I'm also interested in looking for more examples. So maybe some of you have ideas about other case studies or other places that you know or where you come from, these ideas of urban greening or renaturing. But yeah, I think I'll stop there and see.
Okay, which leads to just the first question that I had that I walked up with before I read these. So we're kind of in the middle of a coup d'etat. Big news nationally, kind of dwarfs environmental issues generally. The only thing that's really broken through is the dismantling of the EPA and cutbacks of national parks and that kind of thing. These issues would really be big headlines in a, quote, normal time. Can you think of how this might relate to the big issues involving protecting democracy, and perhaps what are the differences in culture that explain the difference between how we and Europeans have dealt with naturization. A couple of things to start off.
Should I listen first? Right, yeah. Okay, well, yeah. I mean, I have real trouble talking to my students right now, right? I mean, I teach my regular class every 2 years on environmental planning, and I insist on calling it environmental planning in practice. And there's this textbook that was written 10 years ago, and I have some of the updates from the first Trump administration, but right now I walk into the classroom at the beginning of February and try to talk about what the EPA does. And I'm like, which EPA, right? I mean, it's hard. Everything is overshadowed right now. And it is difficult to still sort of like say, yeah, but I mean, I obviously refuse to say that environmentalism is a niche issue, right? Because that's hopefully the gist of part of my talk is about how we relate, not to just each other, but to our environment, to this planet. And I think sort of the galvanizing of environmental issues is obviously like, you know, in this country or, you know, we needed the 70s and that's sort of post-civil rights. But the problem is I think a lot of environmentalism didn't really become effective and sort of come into its own until it properly developed also social consciousness, right? So when I teach and I talk about it's yay, you know, Nixon passed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, but environmental justice and sort of advocating against environmental racism become equally important. So we needed kind of the Robert Bullards of this world who told us about toxic dumping and how we're dumping on community, and that is absolutely as much as an environmental and a social injustice that is happening. So I think, yeah, the wake-up calls for activism, for, you know, remaining an engaged citizen, and where sort of the social and the environmental collide is hopefully where it's at. And yes, it's sort of the rubric of dismantle everything right now, and maybe the EPA is only a small part of it, but I think sort of the larger themes of attacking a way of life that hopefully lives in harmony, right? I mean, that's at the end of the day. What are they slashing? What is the discourse? The discourse is drill, baby, drill, right? What people are reacting against is sort of a extractive vision of living on this planet. So, I mean, I think I do see it's very much connected. You know, it's a different vision for an economy and a way of being. So I don't know if that starts to answer your question of like, why are environmental things still relevant? Because in my mind, they're very much connected, right, to whatever, what do you have up here? Social justice, environmental issues, not separating it.
Thank you. We have a bunch of questions asking for more detail about high-speed rail. Mm-hmm. Are we building the California high-speed train the right way? Can you comment on the tension between environmentalism and developing high-speed rail in general? For instance, and for example, the San Francisco to LA context, there are lesser, smaller routes that are under development. And all right, so
yeah.
You
want me to take that one first?
More detail about that.
Yeah, I could. That's a whole other presentation, and I just. Yeah, I mean, we obviously screwed that one up in many ways, right? Because starting building in the middle, because that was shovel ready. I mean, I don't know how many people are familiar with the general idea of it's a great idea to try to connect the Bay Area and Los Angeles through high-speed rail, precisely because that's where our big population centers are. But politically, of course, this got sort of hijacked to some extent, and not 100% without justification to say, well, it needs to hit the Bakersfield and the Fresnos, and we have sort of future population growth centers. But going through the Central Valley rather than sort of following it up the Grapevine and sort of detouring, and then when it came to actually starting the project, kind of starting it in the middle rather than in the bookends, of course, is highly problematic. And part of what we were sort of trying to do, my colleague colleague Anastasia Locadio-Sederos and I by sort of talking a lot about the need to also invest in the stations as nodes and this idea that the bookends really deserve equal attention. It's not like no money at all for the high-speed rail project has actually gone there. It's just not as visible. Part of it in the Bay Area is surrounding the idea of electrification. I mean, I don't want to be too detailed, but sort of this idea of arguing for investment in when I say bookends, I mean the end stations, right? And not, ultimately it's supposed to go all the way to San Diego, but let's talk LA Bay Area first, right? Getting those large metropolitan regions ready to receive a high-speed rail train, very problematic. So yeah, I mean, I could give lots more detail, but I mean, are we building it the right way? No, of course not, because we start in the middle, it goes from nowhere to nowhere for a really long time, and like any mega projects, and that's actually my main expertise sort of in urban infrastructure is sort of this tendency for things to go vastly over budget, right? So there's this boondoggle aspect of we're now at, what, 140 billion when it was supposed to cost a fraction, and that's what happens with these big infrastructure projects when they're being contested, when landowners are going to court. So no, obviously it's not a smooth, easy project. So it's hard for people like me who very much believe and have seen the reality of good high-speed rail in Europe to keep arguing for something that's obviously not going ideal in its California installment. I don't know, does that answer the question? I hope, to some extent. I don't know who asked the question.
A long time
Yeah.
about that, but not now, right?
You got more questions?
Thank you. There's also been a lot of questions about wetlands restoration. How do you restore a wetland? I have several I'm going to put together regarding clean water, vegetation, and the animal, the flora, the fauna selection. Think also, in addition to Bayona, of the wetlands in Malibu. You're familiar with that, where Malibu Lagoon is? Right. And that restoration. And which version of nature do you recommend? How I don't know, something, well, water and wildlife is covered. Right. And I also want to put into that context, you're probably familiar with, there was a Supreme Court case about 3 years ago where they cut back, it's a narrow decision, I think Alito wrote it, cutting back the waters that were covered, waters of the US, because there was a strip of land between a lake and a developer, and the holding was that they were not connected. So the Supreme Court is rather hostile to, I guess what would be deemed renaturization. So how do those fit together? Particularly, how do you deal with waters and wetlands?
Yeah, I mean, not to try to wiggle out of it, but I think in the talk I kind of said there isn't one easy answer, right? I think at this point in the specific case, and it does have to be a case by case. I mean, so the specific complaints for some of the people regarding the Bayona wetlands is that it had become sort of this cookie cutter thing, right? So Bolsa Chica goes ahead and opens the channel again and the connection, and it becomes sort of a salt marsh solution. Well, that's a tried and true way of bringing better that biodiversity and life back. But let's not just do that everywhere, because in the case of the Bayona wetlands, I think some of these people made a really good case for a complex kind of freshwater ecology environment that also deserved to be reestablished. And then I think the problem is when some environmentalists sort of narrowly contest sort of a master plan solution that was proposed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife on the basis of some of these scientific disagreements. In this case, it's about future sea level rise. And are you rebuilding a very expensive infrastructure, but not actually fully accounting for how the environment is changing in the future? So even though you might want to bring back a version of nature that is appropriate, you actually have to think further ahead, because sea level rise is going to, there's greater salinity, there's storm surges, so we are, works for a planner, right? Looking as much to the future as to the past, and getting that right is really tricky. And again, I am not an ecologist, I'm not an environmental scientist, I'm a social scientist who looks at the discourses surrounding finding these solutions. But I would say that my initial instinct to just want to go with a gentle restoration, I've somewhat reformed, because I do recognize that sometimes bulldozers are needed in order to reshape a highly degraded and impacted environment. That's not a perfect answer, but that's sort of
Thank you. There are a couple of questions that I'm kind of going to put together, I guess, under the rubric of environmental justice.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just read these. How are natural areas, let me go through three of them before you answer. How are natural areas important for urban people to access? Do you find that, quote, creating artificial lakes or other bodies of water end up as places for those with higher incomes, like Phoenix Lake, to enjoy? And I guess the broader question has to do with the way we relate to national parks,
mm-hmm.
Wild areas. There's the theory that they're there for us to enjoy, seeing all
right.
those nice birds and animals and things, versus just letting them be the way they are naturally. Is all of this for all people to enjoy, or just for its own sake, shall we say?
Well, I'm actually hearing three questions, or at least I have three comments. And so for one,
poor folks within
well, exactly. So one of them is sort of what planners wrestle with, and what was the label or your vocabulary word for the day is green gentrification. This idea is that we want urban upgrading, and when we want urban restoration and renaturing and making especially our urban areas more beautiful and greener and healthier again, when we invest in that, it also means if you're upgrading the surrounding neighborhood because now it's in a more desirable area of town, that could sort of lead to what urbanists sort of call a displacement process, right? Gentrification is sort of a reoccupation of higher income groups in centrally areas of disinvestment, right? So you're rediscovering an inner city area in a town. Sort of you have pioneers moving in because they like the cheaper rents. The artists come and they're like, hey, let's the LA River, let's rediscover the LA River. But the more people who do that and the more we're upgrading that area, it becomes hip and wonderful, desirable, and now we even have green investment. The original people who lived there, who were suffering the bad environment, don't actually get to stay because now it's the time of the fancy coffee shops, right? So that's a big conundrum that urban planners have really wrestled with. So this idea of like, well, urban nature is great, but how do we ensure that the people who actually are most nature and green deprived in the grayest and most industrial areas also get to benefit and have access? So the question of greening, the question of access, and again, the argument, the protections usually would come more on the urban policy side, right? Rent protections and actually making sure that people get to stay in the homes and in that same area. So it's maybe not even that you shouldn't invest to make the area nice, but the urban policy side of that actually was something that needs to be activated at the same time. That's certainly the case around the LA River revitalization. So that would be sort of one thing. And then, I mean, some of these other questions of who most needs it, the access, I think there's a lot to be done, especially when sort of what we call the nature gap and getting sort of in frontline or more deprived communities, youth access and education and getting people into nature. And it doesn't have to be very far. You don't have to get them off into Yosemite, right? Access to local urban parks is super important, especially in this region. So some of that could be education, could be community clubs activating, it could be community gardens, all of these things. yes to all of that.
Well, Victory Gardens were how
Yeah.
World War II was won,
Right.
wasn't it?
Yeah.
Or not. What would you comment regarding the destruction of dams to recreate wild rivers?
Mm-hmm.
Does that fit within the renaturification?
Right, Kalamazoo
concept?
River,
Have you
right?
thought
Yeah.
about that? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, that's worldwide. That's one of the biggest problems, right? I mean, here in this country, we're finally coming to the realization that the big dams are problematic. We're undamming. It's sort of like we're tearing down the freeways in the inner cities. We're, removing some of these very destructive large dams. Smaller infrastructures are better. But worldwide, of course, the tendency is still very much hydroelectric power. I mean, think about the Amazon, China. It's sort of this thing, right? I mean, we might be doing better and rethinking some of that in this country, but it's on a global scale, it's still hugely destructive because people think that hydropower is cheap and it's being sold as clean. It's not clean. I think talking to a room that knows that. But yeah, need I say more?
You need not say more.
Okay.
No, thank you. So this will be the last question. I'll just read this because it kind of embodies about 2 or 3 other questions. How has the restoration of Hampshire changed the way people live in the Ruhr Valley? And what further would you comment about the economy, the way of life, recreation, social and cultural aspects of living there?
Right. No, it's a neat question because on one hand, of course, you would say, yeah, it's an asset, right? You have you can ride your bike all along a renaturalized Emscher again. People feel good about something that is clean and green again. But in the particular case of this lake that they also created, right next to the Emscher, my urban sociology colleague at the local university recently wrote an article using the term nostalgia. So like the people who lived there, the working class neighbors that lived there when the steelworks were still there, don't recognize their neighborhood anymore, right? And while they're not necessarily displaced on their side of the lake, sort of the fancy upscale artificial lake where the international soccer players live is not theirs anymore. So it's like that longing for a place that's no longer there because it's been transformed, even though you're physically still there. So this idea of nostalgia is an interesting, and we have that a lot for sort of environmental change, right? It's sort of the idea of that the bird songs are no longer there because there's nature loss. So yeah, so that's not just an answer for the Emscher River, but the larger question of as we're transforming, renaturing, the Humpty Dumpty question, like we can't put it back together the same way it was. So it's a mixed bag depending on what you were used to, what you had, right? But yeah. Thank you all.